Four boys, Ethan Marks, Marcus Cole, Caleb Dyer, and Jonah Pierce, set off into Shenandoah's Gray Hollow for a weekend campout. But by morning, their campsite lay empty, and they were never seen again. For 7 years, no one found a single trace, until a lone camper stumbled across a child's sneaker, dried blood still clinging to its heel. What he uncovered next would unravel one of the park's darkest secrets. The flashlight beam trembled against the undergrowth as Ethan Marks raised it higher, his knuckles white on the handle. The woods of Gray Hollow pressed in around him and his three friends, a cathedral of black trunks and whispering leaves that seemed to bend closer with each step. Behind him, Marcus Cole laughed, the sound nervous and forced, breaking too quickly into silence. "Come on, Ethan," Marcus said, shouldering his pack. His voice was steady enough, but his eyes kept darting to the dark beyond the path. "It's just trees. Don't act like you've never camped before." Caleb Dyer kicked at a root, trying to mask his unease with bravado. "Yeah, trees. And owls. And maybe a bear if we're lucky." His smirk flashed in the glow, but his words were thin, like he was speaking them more to convince himself than anyone else. Jonah Pierce, the youngest, trailed slightly behind, clutching his pocket knife like it was a talisman. He said nothing, his breath quick and shallow, but the way he stayed close to the circle of light showed his mind was running with the same doubts none of them wanted to voice. The abandoned trail was nothing more than a ribbon of dirt swallowed by roots and moss, leading them deeper into the park where even the crickets seemed to hold their tongues. The boys' sneakers scuffed against the ground, the rhythm uneven, their energy carrying them forward though none dared suggest turning back. They were 12, 13, 14, an age when fear was an insult and bravery a currency. And so they laughed too loudly, shouted into the dark as if to prove they weren't afraid, even while their shoulders hunched and their eyes flickered toward every rustle in the brush. "Ethan, where exactly are we setting up?" Marcus asked as the trail dipped into a hollow. His voice was sharper now, strained by the weight of the silence pressing down from all sides. Ethan pointed ahead, toward a small clearing where the canopy broke enough to show a slice of starless sky. "There," he said, his tone firm, though his heart thudded in his chest. "Flat ground, no rocks. We'll set up the tent and be fine." They dropped their packs in the dirt and busied themselves with the tent. The nylon fabric crackled as Jonah fumbled with the poles, his hands shaking more than he wanted anyone to notice. Caleb tossed him a flashlight to steady the work, his own lips pulled into a crooked grin. "What's wrong, Jonah?" "Afraid the trees will eat you if we don't hurry." Jonah forced a laugh, too thin, and bent lower to hide his face in shadow. When the tent finally stood, the boys gathered around a small fire Marcus coaxed to life. Flames licked the night, painting their faces in shifting orange. For a moment, warmth gave them courage again. They pulled out soda cans and granola bars, cracking jokes that fell flat in the vastness around them. Yet even in laughter, their eyes kept drifting to the wall of trees beyond the fire's edge. The darkness there seemed alive, rippling with movements none of them could confirm. Ethan leaned back on his elbows, staring into the void. "You know what my uncle said?" His voice dropped to a hush that drew the others closer. "He said Gray Hollow isn't just trees. He said people used to disappear here. Not animals, not hunters. People." "Shut up," Marcus muttered, tossing a twig into the fire. The crackle was too loud, startling them all. "That's just stories. My dad says it's all rumors to scare kids." "But what if it's true?" Jonah asked quietly, almost to himself. His eyes glistened in the firelight, wide and fearful. What if a branch snapped deep in the woods, cutting him off? The sound echoed sharp and close, like a deliberate step. The boys froze, their bodies taut as bowstrings, the fire crackling the only sound between them. Caleb forced a laugh, though his throat was dry. "It's a deer. Or maybe a raccoon." "Don't lose it, Jonah." But the silence that followed was heavier than before. The forest seemed to lean closer, branches sighing with a wind that hadn't been there a moment ago. Ethan swallowed hard and spoke quickly, too quickly. "We'll be fine. Just sleep, and by morning we'll be back in town telling everyone how easy this was." He tried to sound like a leader, but the way his hand tightened around the flashlight betrayed him. The boys crawled into the tent one by one, their voices hushed, their movements quick. The fire burned lower, shadows stretching longer. Outside, the woods hummed with an energy none of them could name, like 1,000 unseen eyes watching from the dark. Caleb shifted restlessly on his sleeping bag, whispering, "Hear that?" Like someone crying. "No," Marcus muttered, pulling the bag tighter. "It's just wind." But Ethan was still awake, his gaze fixed on the tent wall, as if he could see through it into the forest beyond. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, every nerve alive with dread he couldn't admit. And Jonah, silent, pressed his whistle against his lips, but never blew, afraid of what might answer. The fire sputtered once, sparks flying upward, then faded into embers. The night swallowed their camp whole, leaving only the faintest trace of laughter, carried back through the trees like an echo that didn't belong to them. By morning, their campsite lay empty. Rangers scoured the area for weeks, finding only scattered items: a torn shoelace, a crushed soda can, and a small strip of red fabric snagged on a branch. No bodies, no tracks leading out, nothing but silence and unanswered questions. Families held on to hope, but whispers spread quickly through the nearby town of Halebridge that something older than crime lurked in the park. Parents warned children not to wander too far. The official story faded into unsolved tragedy, but rumors only grew louder. Some claimed hunters had seen strange lights in the forest that night. Others swore the boys were victims of a hidden recluse who lived off-grid. The case grew cold, sealed in files, until the woods themselves seemed to swallow the memory. And yet, 7 years later, a man named Victor Hale, an unassuming camper looking for solitude, pitched his tent on the same forgotten path. That night, as he sat by the fire, he heard the faint cry of boys echoing from the trees. It was as if the forest had been waiting for someone to listen. Victor startled when the sound reached him. A cry, thin and distant, wound through the tangled woods like a thread of sorrow. He lifted his head sharply from the fire, the stick in his hand pausing mid-stir as sparks drifted up into the black canopy. For a moment he sat still, listening, the hair at the back of his neck prickling. The forest was otherwise silent. No crickets, no owls, just that fleeting wail echoing faintly between the trunks. He swallowed hard and forced a laugh under his breath. "Wind," he muttered, though the word felt weak, an excuse spoken only to himself. The firelight flickered across his face, showing the tight lines of unease in his jaw. He tossed another branch into the flames, trying to drown the sound with crackle and heat, but his eyes never stopped scanning the darkness. When he rose to stretch, his lantern beam caught something beside the tent. A strip of cloth clung to a tree, nailed into the bark. It hung limp, its edges frayed, but its red color burned against the pale wood as if time had not dulled it. Victor stepped closer, reaching out slowly with 2 fingers. The fabric was stiff, cold, as though it had been waiting for a hand to touch it. He jerked back, shaking his fingers as if the memory of it clung to his skin. "Someone left this," he whispered, his voice hushed, uncertain whether he hoped to convince himself it was recent or feared that it wasn't. The nailed scrap shifted slightly in the breeze, the faint creak of wood and metal groaning together like an old hinge. Sleep that night refused him. Every sigh of the trees felt weighted. Every crack of settling branches made him turn in his blankets. He tried to reason through it, fabric left behind by hunters, a trick of acoustics carrying the sound of animals, but the arguments fell hollow. At dawn, the forest mist curled low, wrapping the ground in silver veils. Victor rose stiffly, rubbing the fatigue from his eyes, and decided he would not let fear master him. He slung his bag over one shoulder, tightened the laces of his boots, and chose a narrow deer path leading deeper into the hollow. The earth was damp beneath his soles, each step sucking faintly as if the ground resisted. Beams of pale sunlight pierced through gaps in the canopy, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air. The silence unsettled him more than noise would have. Not even the chirp of a bird. He pushed on, telling himself that discovery would ease the unease. Then his toe struck something hard. He knelt, brushed aside moss, and froze. An old flashlight lay crooked in the dirt. The casing was corroded, its metal pitted and eaten by years of damp, but the shape was familiar. He turned it over in his palm, thumb brushing across the faded brand name etched shallow into the handle. His breath caught. He had seen one like this as a boy, a model no store sold anymore. Something about it whispered of a life cut short, abandoned. "This doesn't belong here," he murmured, his voice barely more than a rasp. When he lifted his gaze, his eyes snagged on the trunk before him. Letters were carved deep into the bark, uneven, shaking as though cut in panic. Yem. 2 initials, simple yet heavy with desperation. He reached forward, touching the grooves with the tips of his fingers. The edges were rough, splintered. Whoever carved them had pressed the blade hard, harder than would required, as if fighting against more than bark. He stood staring, the air around him thick, unmoving. For several minutes, the world seemed to shrink to the mark and his shallow breaths. By the time he returned to camp, the sun had tilted high, though the canopy filtered it into a dim green twilight. He felt steadier with the evidence in hand, though unease still pressed heavy. Perhaps, he thought, he could rationalize the cry, the cloth, the initials. Maybe they were relics of old campers, long forgotten. But as he stepped into the clearing where his tent waited, he stopped cold. The fire pit had been disturbed. He had banked the ashes carefully before leaving, a habit from years of camping. Now the soil was scattered, charred wood overturned. His lantern beam caught on fragments within the pit, small, blackened shapes, brittle against the pale ash. Bones. Not branches, not stones. Tiny, fragile bones, cracked and charred. A smell rose with them, faint but unmistakable, curling into his nostrils. His stomach twisted. He crouched slowly, staring, unwilling to touch. His voice trembled when it broke the silence. No, this wasn't here before. The forest gave no reply, only the endless weight of its watching silence. Victor's skin prickled, and a chill slid down his spine as he stood alone among the trees. He backed toward his tent, his chest rising and falling too quickly. The strip of red fabric swayed in the dim air, the initials on the tree burned in his mind, the corroded flashlight heavy in his pocket. He could no longer deny what the air itself told him. Victor realized then that solitude was no longer his companion. He was not alone in the forest. Victor's hands trembled as he scraped at the damp soil with the edge of a broken branch. The air around him seemed unnaturally still, every breath he took echoing too loudly in his ears. His lantern threw an unsteady glow across the forest floor, lighting the tree trunk scarred with the initials he had discovered earlier. Something inside him had refused to let it go. The teacher in him, the man who had told countless students never to shy away from answers, now forced him to press deeper, though each movement made his chest grow tighter. He pushed aside layers of wet leaves until his fingers struck against metal. The sound was small, a dull scrape, yet it rang like a thunderclap in the silence. Victor froze, then brushed harder until the object emerged. His throat went dry. A pocket knife, its blade rusted shut, its wooden handle cracked with age, but its engraved letters still visible. MC Marcus Cole. Victor stared at the initials for a long time, his breath clouding in the cool night air. He didn't know how he recognized the name, only that it lodged in his mind like a thorn, certain to bleed him later when memory caught up. For now, the reality of holding the object pressed against him with suffocating weight. The knife had not been lost, it had been placed. It stood upright in the ground as though stabbed deliberately, a marker left behind, or worse, a warning. He swallowed hard and whispered, almost without meaning to, "Why here? Who put you here?" His voice sounded brittle, almost swallowed by the trees. No answer came, only the distant rustle of branches swaying against one another. That night, unease refused him sleep. Victor lay inside his tent, eyes wide, lantern casting faint shadows along the canvas. The forest had a heartbeat now. Every creak, every snap seemed to pulse with intent. Sometime after midnight, a sound thudded against the thin fabric wall. His heart jolted into his throat. He sat upright, clutching the lantern handle until his knuckles whitened. Slowly, carefully, he unzipped the tent flap and pushed his way out, the night air chilling his sweat-soaked skin. The flame illuminated the small clearing, revealing what had pressed against him. A shoe. Not just any shoe, but a child's sneaker torn along its sides, its rubber sole curling with age. Victor bent down, hands shaking as he lifted it. The fabric was stiff, the laces frayed, and at the heel, dried blood had crusted into the material. He turned it over in his palm, feeling the weight of years pressing down. His mind reeled. Could it really belong to one of the missing boys? The thought pressed against him, sharp and undeniable. Behind him, the fire crackled weakly, the lantern's glow throwing his shadow long and crooked across the clearing. He turned slowly, lantern raised, and caught sight of the ground. His breath hitched. A trail of prints spread across the dirt, muddy, small, unmistakable. The shape was clear: toes, arches, heels. The feet of children. They stretched away into the underbrush like a beckoning path. He followed them with his eyes, and his chest tightened when he realized they did not vanish. They circled. Victor stepped closer, holding his lantern out as though light alone could protect him. The prints curved around his camp in a wide arc, then doubled back, weaving in erratic patterns until they closed into a complete ring. He turned slowly, following them in a dizzying loop until he stood again where he had begun. Dozens of tiny footprints had encircled him, trapping him within their path. His mouth went dry. "Who's there?" he whispered, voice cracking despite himself. "Who's out here?" The trees stood silent, their branches swaying faintly. Yet the silence felt heavier now, pressing down like a hand over his mouth. He waited, lantern trembling his grip, but no answer came. Only the sharp sting of cold wind cutting across his face and the whisper of leaves brushing together in the darkness. He lowered the shoe slowly, his mind racing in spirals of logic and fear. If children had been here, who were they? Where had they gone? And if they weren't children anymore, then what had left these prints? The fire sputtered behind him, shrinking to embers. Victor's shadow vanished into the dark, leaving him alone with the ring of prints and the sneaker still clutched to his chest. He tried once more, louder this time, his voice almost breaking. "Who's there?" The forest did not reply. Victor whispered into the dark, asking who was there, but the silence that answered was heavier than words. By the third day, Victor's fear had hardened into something far more dangerous than panic, an obsession that made his hands restless and his thoughts feverish. The map of footprints he had begun tracing in the dirt beside his camp grew like a web. Lines of twigs marking each path where small, uneven impressions wandered through the soil. He crouched over it for hours, lips pressed tight, whispering the measurements under his breath as if memorizing a lesson for school. His chest ached from lack of sleep, yet his mind clung to the puzzle. If he could follow the prints, if he could trace where they ended, maybe he would find sense in the madness. The sticks pointed him toward a hollow, clearing deep within the forest. The air grew heavier as he walked, damp moss clinging to his boots, the canopy pressing down so thickly that the sky seemed forgotten. When he stepped into the clearing, silence struck him first, so complete that even the insects seemed to hold their breath. At the center stood an oak tree older than any he had ever seen, its trunk swollen and gnarled, bark carved with jagged marks that stopped his breath. They were not words, not symbols of any kind he knew, just wild slashes, overlapping and furious, like the desperate scrapes of someone who had no language left. Victor raised his lantern higher, the trembling flame throwing shadows across the scars. "What happened to you?" he muttered aloud, his voice rough, trembling. His words vanished without echo, swallowed by the stillness. He told himself it was vandals, boys with knives, but his gut rejected the thought. There was no pattern in the carvings, only panic, only ritual. Beneath the oak, the ground dipped into a shallow pit, its sides sagging inward. Stones rimmed its edge, their surfaces blackened by fire long extinguished. The smell of ash still clung faintly to the soil. Victor knelt, pressing his palm to the dirt. It was loose, disturbed, as though turned over again and again. He pushed his fingers in, then his hand, clawing gently until something sharp touched his skin. He pulled free a small bone, pale and fragile, no bigger than his finger. His breath hitched. It was not deer. He brushed more soil aside, uncovering fragments, a rib, splintered clean, a jaw, teeth faintly marked with grooves like pressure, like biting. His stomach turned violently, and he staggered back, pressing the back of his hand against his mouth. The pit was no burial ground. It was a feeding ground, opened and reopened across seasons. He forced himself to look again, to confront what his mind begged him to deny. Some pieces were cleanly broken, others scarred with shallow ridges. He thought of teeth again, teeth gnawing, testing. He whispered hoarsely, "Children's bones." The moment the words left him, the forest pressed closer. A weight of silence bore down on him, heavy, suffocating. His breath came shallow. The hairs on his arms rose as though touched by unseen fingers. He spun sharply, lantern swinging. For a fraction of a heartbeat, he saw movement, a small figure darting between trunks, quick as shadow, limbs thin, head tilted at an unnatural angle. A boy's silhouette. "Wait!" Victor's voice cracked, desperate, raw. He lurched forward. Reaching out, though, there was nothing to catch. "You don't have to hide. I can help you." His words tumbled over themselves, breaking apart in fear and hope. But the forest mocked him. From the trees came laughter, thin, brittle, high-pitched like children's mirth, but wrong, twisted. It rose and fell in uneven bursts, echoing from no direction and every direction at once. Victor stumbled back, his lantern shaking wildly, light jerking across the clearing. He clutched his chest, heart hammering as he whispered to himself, "It's not real. It's not real." Yet the laughter refused to fade, lingering even as he turned and fled through the underbrush. By the time he reached camp, sweat streaked his face, dirt clung to his clothes, and his breath burned his throat. Relief lasted only a second before terror struck again. His tent sagged unnaturally, canvas sliced into ribbons as though clawed by something savage. He staggered closer, lifting the lantern. Across the fabric, smeared in dark red strokes, were words scrawled with a trembling hand. They glistened wet in the light, the letters uneven but unmistakable. "We never left." Victor barely slept that night, though exhaustion pressed down on him like a weight. His eyes burned from keeping watch, his ears straining at every creak and sigh of the forest. He sat upright most of the hours, lantern close, knife across his lap, listening to the branches groan as if burdened by unseen movement. Each rustle in the undergrowth made his heart leap. Each shift of shadow forced him to imagine figures just beyond his sight. When dawn finally broke, pale light filtering through the trees, it felt less like relief and more like reprieve. His body trembled with fatigue, but his mind had already made its decision. He would not wait for the answers to come to him. He would confront them head-on. He packed a small bag methodically, hands shaking with both fear and determination. He placed his lantern inside, though the sun was already rising. A voice inside him whispered that daylight might not matter here, that light itself bent in gray hollow. He strapped the bag closed, inhaled deeply, and forced his weary body forward. The oak tree came into view like a sentinel, its gnarled branches stretching wide as if to hold back intruders. The clearing around it was quiet, unnaturally so, as though the forest itself held its breath. Victor circled the tree slowly, scanning for anything he had missed. The soil crunched under his boots, damp but brittle, and the silence pressed so hard against his chest it almost hurt. Then his eyes caught movement, or rather, the illusion of it. A rope swayed gently from a high branch, though no wind stirred the leaves. He stepped closer, his throat tightening. The rope was frayed, thick strands green with mildew, but the loop at its end was unmistakable. His stomach lurched. It was not the casual loop of rope left behind from camping or climbing. It was deliberate, formed to bind. He imagined wrists caught there, small arms pulled upward, and his hands clenched into fists against the image. Beneath the rope, half hidden by decayed leaves, something blue caught the light. Victor crouched and brushed the debris away. His breath faltered. Scraps of denim fabric lay stiff in the soil, the edges jagged as if cut with a blade. He lifted one piece and rubbed it between his fingers. It was cold, damp, and unyielding, hardened with age. He turned it over, his eyes narrowing as he saw a faint stain darkening the cloth. Something old, something that refused to fade, even with time. His chest tightened with the weight of it, and for a moment, his vision blurred with the unsteady beat of panic. He whispered under his breath, as if speaking might ground him, "This is real. Someone was here." His own voice sounded strange, hushed yet trembling, almost a plea for reason. The forest gave no answer. Victor rose, denim clutched in his hand, and pressed on. Each step deeper into the trail pulled him further from the safety of logic. He kept glancing over his shoulder, convinced he would find figures trailing him. But the woods remained still, their silence oppressive. Then he spotted the hollow log. It rested against a cluster of roots, its bark split open like a wound. Something about it seemed staged, unnatural in its placement, as though waiting for discovery. Kneeling beside it, Victor peered into the shadowed opening. His pulse quickened. Inside, shielded by a cracked plastic bag, lay the edges of photographs, white corners blurred by age, yet intact. His hands trembled as he reached inside. The plastic crinkled loudly in the silence, each sound magnified until it felt deafening. He pulled the bag free, dirt falling from its surface, and carefully opened it. 3 Polaroids slid into his palm, their images ghostly in the morning light. The first photo showed a fire, blurred at the edges, with boys seated around it. Their faces were indistinct, blurred by time or movement, but the shapes of their bodies were clear, small, hunched, young. Victor's throat closed. His fingers shook as he traced the outlines of the figures, imagining the boys from the newspaper clippings, their families' grieving faces etched in his memory from research the day before. The second photo stole the air from his lungs. It was the clearing where he now stood, the oak tree looming at its center. But behind the tree, half obscured by shadow, stood a figure. Tall, skeletal, faceless, its shape wrong in a way that defied reason. His hand nearly dropped the picture, his body recoiling as though distance could protect him from the memory captured in that square of faded film. The third photo was blank at first glance, a washed-out canvas of pale gray. But as he tilted it under the light, faint scratches revealed themselves, etched into the surface as though someone had clawed the image itself. Letters formed slowly under his gaze, uneven and desperate. They spelled one word: help. Victor's breath came ragged now. His chest heaved as he lowered the photos, his mind battling between disbelief and terror. No, this can't. He trailed off, clutching the images tighter, the edges digging into his palm. His rational mind screamed for an explanation. Teenagers playing a cruel trick, discarded relics of some forgotten prank. But deep inside, something darker whispered, insisting that what he held was not chance. The air shifted then, a breeze rising without warning. It carried with it a sound that did not belong to the wind. Soft, broken, unmistakable, children crying. The sobs were faint at first, carried through the trees as if from far away, yet close enough to pierce through him. Victor staggered back, clutching the photos to his chest, his eyes darting wildly among the trees. "Who's there?" he shouted, voice cracking with strain. Silence answered, but the sobbing persisted, threading through the branches until it felt like the forest itself wept. His knees buckled under the weight of it all, and he sank to the ground, clutching the bag, the denim, the photographs, as if they were anchors against a truth too heavy to bear. The earth smelled of rot and dampness, the kind of scent that clings and never releases. In that moment, Victor realized that the world had shifted. The line between evidence and haunting had begun to blur, and Victor could no longer tell which side he stood on. Victor's hands trembled as he slid the cracked Polaroids back into their brittle sleeve. He hadn't dared look at them again since the night he found them, but they weighed on his conscience like stones. Now, back in town, he pushed open the heavy door of the Halebridge Library, its hinges groaning in protest. The air smelled of dust and old paper, the kind of silence that pressed on the ears until even the softest footsteps seemed too loud. He kept his head down, not wanting curious eyes to linger. With the Polaroids hidden in his jacket pocket, he moved quickly toward the far corner where the microfilm reels rested in battered cabinets, forgotten relics of another time. Sliding into a chair, Victor unspooled a reel with careful fingers, his eyes straining against the dim glow of the overhead lamp. Headlines flickered past: fires, lost hikers, old elections, until at last he saw the faces. 4 boys, grainy black and white photos that had once hung in storefronts and post offices. Ethan Marks, Caleb Dyer, Marcus Cole, Jonah Pierce. Their eyes stared out from the page, young and uncertain, unaware their images would someday serve as markers of tragedy. Victor leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass as he whispered their names aloud, a quiet roll call no one else had spoken in years. Each article carried the same hollow hope. Search teams continue. Families plead for answers. Authorities deny. Foul play suspected. Yet what chilled them most was a single, nearly forgotten detail buried in a side column. Campers, days after the disappearance, had reported hearing cries in the night near Gray Hollow. The explanation offered: foxes, owls, wind. Victor gritted his teeth. Foxes don't sound like boys, he muttered, fingers tightening on the reel until the knob creaked. When he returned to camp, dusk pressed heavy over the trees. His boots sank into soft earth, the forest air damp and metallic with the coming night. Relief flickered when he saw the faint outline of his fire pit, but the feeling vanished as soon as he stepped closer. His supplies gone. The tent he had pitched with methodical care now lay shredded, the nylon torn into ribbons that fluttered in the breeze. His sleeping bag was ripped clean down the middle, stuffing scattered like pale entrails across the dirt. His throat tightened. "No," he whispered hoarsely, his voice raw. He dropped to his knees, tearing through the mess with frantic hands. "Where are they?" His fingers scraped against bare earth, searching for the Polaroids he had carried like lifelines. They were gone. Every single one. His breath came hard and shallow, eyes darting across the ruined campsite. It wasn't just vandalism. The destruction felt deliberate, mocking like a warning. He dug at the soil near the fire pit, desperate for some trace, until his fingertips struck something hard. At first he thought it was a stone. Then he brushed aside the loose dirt and froze. Etched deep into the ground was a drawing. Crude, yet unmistakable. 4 stick figures stood in a row, hand in hand, their lines jagged and uneven as though carved in haste. Beside them loomed a 5th, taller, its arms stretched wide, its head larger than the rest. 2 hollow circles marked its eyes, empty yet piercing, as though staring straight into him. Victor recoiled, his hands shaking, his stomach twisting with the slow realization. Someone had been here. Someone had been close enough to kneel in his camp, scratch this into the earth, and leave without a trace. His throat tightened, and though the words barely left his lips, he said them anyway. "You've been watching me." The forest was still, suffocating, yet Victor swore he felt movement just beyond the reach of his vision, branches shifting, the air quivering as though holding its breath. His chest ached, caught between terror and grim understanding. The Polaroids had been taken not by accident, not by chance. They had been reclaimed. His eyes lingered on the hollow circles gouged into the dirt. They seemed bottomless, windows into something patient and cruel. He pressed a hand against the ground as though it might answer him, but the soil remained cold, unyielding. The fire pit flickered with the last embers of light, the shadows stretching long and hungry across the clearing. And in that silence, Victor knew he was no longer the one uncovering the past. The past had found him. Victor realized then that whatever had taken the boys had also been watching him from the moment he entered the woods. The fire had burned low, casting a sickly orange glow that flickered against the walls of the trees. Victor sat rigid, his hands tight around the small pocket knife, the blade quivering each time his breath shook. The forest seemed to lean in closer than before, the branches creaking softly like old bones. When the sound came, a rustle, faint yet deliberate, his body snapped upright. His heart hammered so hard he thought the noise might draw whatever lingered beyond the firelight. He turned, knife raised though his grip was clumsy with fear. And then he saw them, for figures no taller than children, slipped from the tree line into the trembling glow of the flames. Their movements were not natural but slow, uneven, as though pulled forward by strings. Pale skin stretched too tightly across their faces, shadows deep in the hollows of their eyes. Their clothes hung in tatters, ragged strips of fabric that whispered against the leaves as they moved. Victor staggered back a step, his voice breaking into the night without his consent. Ethan, Caleb, Marcus, Jonah. The names spilled out like prayers, like confessions, his throat tightening with each syllable. He did not know why he spoke them, only that some part of him recognized these shapes for what they once had been. The figures reacted in eerie unison, their heads tilting sharply, as though curious children studying a teacher they half remembered. Firelight washed across their faces, but the more Victor tried to focus, the more the features blurred. Their mouths did not move, yet he swore he felt their silence pressing against him, heavy and unbearable. One of the figures, smaller than the rest, stepped forward. The air grew colder, his breath puffing visibly though the night was not yet that cold. The figure crouched, or rather collapsed forward, limbs stiff, before dropping something to the ground. The sound was small but sharp, with striking stone. Then, with the same strange motion, the figure retreated, folding back into the shadows as though pulled by unseen hands. Victor swallowed hard and lowered his knife just enough to see. His hand trembled as he reached for the object on the ground. When his fingers closed around it, the texture was unmistakable. Smooth wood, worn from years of use, cracked but whole. In the dim glow of the fire, he turned it over and saw the letters carved faintly into the surface. J.P. His breath caught. Jonah Pierce, he whispered, voice rough, the name tasting both foreign and familiar on his tongue. He remembered it from newspaper articles he had studied. The youngest boy, the one who never went anywhere without his whistle, a gift from his older brother. He clutched it now, the weight heavier than it should have been, as though it carried years of grief with it. He looked up quickly, scanning the trees, but the clearing was empty. The fire sputtered, throwing sparks into the air, and the four figures were gone as silently as they had appeared. The night seemed to swallow them whole. And then the sound came. High, thin, and piercing, the whistle echoed through the forest. Not from the wooden piece in his hand, but from somewhere beyond, weaving through the trees. It was too steady, too long to be wind, and too precise to be imagined. The sound seemed to dance in circles around him, sometimes close to his ear, sometimes far into the woods. It made the hairs along his arms rise, made his chest tighten as though the sound itself pressed against his lungs. Victor pressed the whistle against his chest, gripping it until his knuckles blanched. His thoughts ran wild. Was this a message? A warning? Or were they luring him deeper, binding him to their fate? He wanted to run, to abandon the fire, the clearing, the cursed woods, but another thought rooted him where he stood. If the boys had given him this, they had chosen him for a reason. He could not yet decide if that was a gift or a curse. The whistle's echo faded into the dark, leaving only the rasp of his own breath and the crackle of dying flames. He tightened his grip on the knife, though it felt useless now, a child's toy against forces he could not name. He closed his eyes, whispering words that felt hollow in the stillness. I'll help you if I can. His voice cracked, the plea falling in a silence that offered no reply. Victor stood alone in the circle of firelight, a single man clutching a broken whistle and a dull knife, while the vast woods pressed closer, hungrier, patient. The weight of the object in his hand was unbearable, not because it was heavy, but because it was proof. Proof of lives not lost, but trapped. In the distance, faint whistling echoed, though no breath carried it. He gripped the whistle tightly, the weight of responsibility pressing on him. If the boys were still here, they weren't alive, but they weren't gone either. They were trapped, and Victor had stumbled into their prison. Victor tightened his grip on the lantern as the whistle threaded through the night air, sharp and distant, yet impossibly near. Each note seemed to guide his feet along a path he could not see, pulling him deeper into the trees until the glow of his campfire was swallowed whole by the forest. The ground beneath him grew uneven, roots rising like twisted veins, branches arching overhead to block out the stars. His breath puffed, white in the chill, though the night was not cold enough for frost. He wondered if it was his own fear that made the air bite harder than it should. Still, he followed, because the sound was not just a call, it was a demand. The lantern's light finally revealed the outline of a structure, a cabin half collapsed, its frame buckling under years of neglect. Broken windows gaped like hollow eyes, and the roof sagged in the middle as if crushed by some unseen weight. Victor's steps slowed, but he forced himself forward. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle. The rusted metal was cold, gritty, resisting his pull until the door gave way with a long, aching creak that seemed far too loud in the silence of the forest. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and something sharper, metallic like dried blood or rusted iron. Dust spiraled in the lantern's glow, disturbed by his presence. Victor hesitated at the threshold, every instinct screaming at him to leave, yet his feet betrayed him, stepping onto the warped boards that groaned under his weight. His eyes widened as the lantern revealed the floor. Clothes, piles of them, small shirts, stiff denim, sneakers scuffed and brittle with age. Some fabric had fused together, stiff and darkened where blood had long dried. He bent, unwilling but compelled, and picked up a sleeve. It cracked like old parchment in his hands. His throat tightened, and he whispered, "Oh God!" These were theirs. The walls drew his attention next. At first, he thought the wood had rotted unevenly, but as the lantern moved, the truth emerged, scratches, countless scratches, carved so deep the grain splintered apart. Words, please, some barely legible, others etched over and over with desperate force. Help us. We're here. Initials, names, repeated like prayers no one ever answered. Victor staggered back, pressing his hand to the wall as if steadying himself against the grief carved into its bones. In the corner, something glinted faintly. A steel box, battered but intact, sat among the debris. Kneeling, he brushed away dust and pried it open. The hinges resisted, shrieking before giving way. Inside lay Polaroids, dozens, perhaps more than 100, stacked carelessly but preserved within the rusted container. His hands trembled as he lifted the top photo into the light. Children stared back at him. For boys, huddled together, ropes biting into their wrists, dirt smudged across terrified faces. Their eyes wide, hollow, frozen in helpless fear, burned into his mind. He flipped through another and another. In one, they sat near a fire. In another, they were inside this very cabin, shadows looming behind them. Some were smeared with fingerprints, dark stains crusted at the edges. Victor's breath came ragged. His stomach churned while rising. The photographs weren't just evidence of tragedy. They were proof that someone had been here, had done this, had documented it with twisted care. His mind raced with questions. Who had taken them? Why keep the pictures? Why here? A photograph slipped free, fluttering from his trembling hands to the floor. Face down. He reached for it, dread gnawing at his chest. Slowly, he turned it over. The lantern shook in his grip as his own face stared back at him. Not from years ago, not blurred with age, but clear, alive. Him, sitting by his campfire, the flame lighting his features exactly as it had only nights ago. His breath caught, a sound more like a sob. He turned in a circle, searching the cabin's shadows. "No," he whispered, voice breaking. "That's not possible. It can't be." The walls seemed to close in, the carved words pulsing in the lamplight. He thought of the whistle that had led him here, of the footprints around his camp, of the voices that whispered his name in the dark. He was not uncovering the past. He was being watched in the present. The lantern slipped from his trembling hand, glass cracking as it hit the floor. Flames sputtered, darkness rushing in. Only a faint glow of moonlight bled through the shattered window, silvering the edges of the Polaroids scattered across the boards. Victor's heart hammered as he crouched, fumbling blindly, his ears straining against the silence. And then it broke. A sound, small, deliberate, from the far corner of the cabin. Something shifting against the wood, slow and heavy, like the drag of a limb or the scrape of bone. The air thickened, stilled, as though the cabin itself held its breath. Victor's eyes locked on the shadow pooling at the edge of the room. He whispered again, barely more than air, "Who's there?" The silence gave no answer, but in that stillness, in the dark that pressed against him like a weight, he knew one thing with perfect clarity. He was not alone. Victor dropped the lantern then, and in the sudden dark, something in the cabin moved. Victor froze in the pitch-black cabin, the photograph trembling in his hand, its glossy surface catching only the faintest sliver of moonlight from the shattered window. His breath came in uneven bursts, each exhale clouding the cold air before vanishing into the dark. The silence pressed against him, heavy and suffocating, until it was broken by a low creak in the corner, a sound so slow and deliberate that it sent a chill down his spine. It was not the snap of old timber settling. It was the shifting of weight, the undeniable suggestion of something alive sharing the space with him. His heart pounded violently, echoing in his ears, yet beneath that thunder he caught the faint rhythm of another presence, breathing. Wet, raspy, uneven breaths scraped through the shadows, dragging across his nerves like nails on stone. He tried to steady himself, clutching the photograph tighter, but his fingers shook so badly that the glossy paper crinkled. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body betrayed him, feet heavy, rooted to the decaying wooden floor. Slowly, with painstaking care, he began backing toward the door, one hand stretched behind him as if touch alone could find the exit. The pocket knife in his other hand wavered in the gloom, its small blade glinting faintly whenever the moonlight shifted. He imagined, foolishly, that it might protect him, though the weight in the corner suggested otherwise. Then it came, a sudden, piercing whistle, sharp and shrill, so close it felt like it had erupted beside his ear. He spun, knife raised, eyes wide. The corner behind him was empty. Only dust floated in the fractured moonlight. His throat tightened, a ragged gasp escaping before he could choke it down. On the table, the box of photographs toppled with a hollow thud, scattering across the floor like leaves in a storm. The sound was too loud in the quiet, each photo sliding across the warped planks with an accusing whisper. Victor bent instinctively, lantern forgotten, hand brushing over the scattered images. His gaze snagged on one at the center of the mess. It was not curled with age like the others, not yellowed or water-damaged. Its edges were crisp, the surface still glossy, the ink barely dried. Victor's chest constricted as he lifted it. His breath faltered. There he was himself, frozen in the photograph, standing in the doorway of the cabin, shoulders hunched, knife in hand. The detail was too sharp to deny, too recent to dismiss. His eyes in the photo were wide, staring into the room exactly as he had done seconds ago. The photo had been taken tonight. No worse moments ago. A tremor of cold dread gripped him, sliding into his bones like ice. He looked around the cabin walls, the shadows, the ceiling beams, the broken window. Someone had been watching him. Someone had captured him. They weren't gone. They were here. He tried to swallow, but his throat was dry, a knot of fear refusing to move. His voice cracked when he whispered into the dark. "Who's there?" The sound was pitiful, thin, swallowed by the cabin as though the walls themselves denied him an answer. His knuckles whitened around the photograph. For the first time since he entered the forest, it was not only the past that terrified him, it was the present. The realization clawed at him. The boys had not vanished into myth or legend. Whoever had taken them had been here all along, silent and careful, always a step ahead, and now that same force had turned its gaze on him. The shadows pressed closer, each corner of the cabin alive with suggestion, but Victor's survival instincts surged. He bolted. His boots pounded against the rotting floorboards, the door shrieking on its hinges as he shoved it open. Cold night air hit his lungs like a slap, sharp and bracing. He stumbled out into the undergrowth, branches clawing at his arms, his knife nearly slipping from his sweat-slick fingers. The forest swallowed him, its canopy blotting out the stars, its paths winding in directions he no longer trusted. Behind him, the cabin loomed, silent once more, but the knowledge festered. He had been watched, toyed with, recorded. Each step forward felt guided by unseen hands. Each rustle of leaves another reminder that he had trespassed into a place that did not intend to let him leave. His breath rasped in his chest, his heart beat wild. Yet even as his body fought to escape, his mind repeated a single truth, one that burned hotter than fear. Finally, his strength broke, and he collapsed against the thick trunk of a tree near the hollow clearing, the bark biting into his back. His chest heaved, ragged, as he clutched the small wooden whistle tight in his fist, the carved initials pressing into his skin. It was the only thing that tethered him to reality, the only proof he wasn't simply unraveling inside some nightmare. His eyes darted into the darkness, every shadow alive, every whisper of wind a breath too close. He told himself to stay still, to rest, but the forest denied him even that. The sound came slowly at first, the faint crunch of leaves. Then again and again, a steady rhythm that circled him in a perfect ring, as though unseen feet were pacing just beyond his sight. His head whipped left, then right, lantern light casting quick flares across twisted branches, but nothing moved in his vision. Yet the footsteps continued, deliberate, patient. His throat tightened as laughter rose out of the dark, thin, childlike, a chorus of fragile giggles. But layered beneath was something else, something older, deeper, the tone mocking and cruel. Victor pressed his back harder to the tree, nails digging into the bark. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice breaking halfway through. Silence answered him, broken only by the continued rustle of circling feet. Driven by desperation, Victor forced himself to stand. His legs shook under his weight, but he gritted his teeth. Proof, that was all that mattered now. Proof he could carry out of these woods. Proof that someone beyond him would have to believe. His gaze fell toward the great oak tree at the center of the clearing, its blackened scars catching the pale light of the moon. He had seen the shallow pit there before, the disturbed soil and fragments of bone. Now, some inner compulsion told him to go deeper, to unearth what the forest still tried to hide. He staggered toward it, nearly falling as his foot caught in the uneven earth, but he pressed on. Dropping to his knees beside the pit, Victor clawed at the dirt with his bare hands. The soil was damp and clung to his skin, filling the cracks between his fingernails. His hands shook as he tore at the earth, ignoring the sting as his nails bent and split, ignoring the warmth of blood rising from his torn fingertips. Every scrape of dirt away was met with the pounding of his heart, the sound of it deafening in his ears. "Show me," he muttered hoarsely, his voice trembling. "Just show me what's here." The earth gave way reluctantly, as though resisting, but soon something hard struck his fingers. Cold iron. He dug faster, desperate, until the shape revealed itself. A rusted chain coiled beneath the soil, its thick links bolted into the ground itself. At first he thought it no more than abandoned debris, but then the links shivered. He froze, staring at them. They rattled faintly, almost vibrating, though no hand had touched them. The sound carried into the pit like a warning, metallic and alive. Victor's mouth went dry. Was it the wind? His rational mind grasped for excuses, but deep down he knew the chain had moved for him, because of him. His breath quickened, but still his hands pushed further, uncovering more of the chain until it spread like veins beneath the oak, stretching into the earth as if rooting something far below. Then his fingers brushed something brittle. He swept dirt aside, carefully this time, though his body trembled with fear. Pale bone emerged, fragile and cracked, so small it could never belong to an animal. He brushed further until a skull appeared, its crown fractured, soil pressed deep into the seams. A strip of cloth was still wound around the jaw, a gag stiff with age, holding silence even in death. Victor recoiled, his stomach turning violently. He stumbled backward on all fours, bile rising in his throat until he retched into the leaves. His mind reeled, images flashing of boys crying, boys tied, boys silenced. He pressed his hand to his mouth, shuddering, but the sight of the skull drew his eyes back like a curse. The chain rattled again, sharper this time, as though in response to his discovery. The earth shifted faintly beneath the pit, sending vibrations into his knees. He staggered to his feet, swaying, his pulse wild with terror. The forest around him hushed, every sound swallowed into stillness. Even the laughter had stopped. He looked at the skull again, its hollow sockets fixed on him, and in that moment he understood something horrifying. These boys hadn't simply been left to die. They had been restrained, gagged, chained to the earth itself. They hadn't been allowed escape, in life or in death. Their suffering had been deliberate, ritualistic, as though offered to the forest. Victor staggered back, whispering aloud as though speaking the truth would make it real. They weren't buried. They were bound. The wind rose suddenly, fierce and cold, cutting through the clearing like a blade. The oak above him groaned, its branches swaying though the air carried no scent of storm. Shadows darted at the edges of his vision, fleeting shapes of small figures, watching him dig. His lantern flickered in the sudden gust, lights stretching into thin, warped shapes across the clearing. He clutched the whistle tighter, his knuckles white, whispering, "I see you. I know what happened." The forest gave no answer. Only the chain, rattling faintly, like something straining to break free beneath the soil. His chest heaved, and he stumbled back from the pit, the skull still staring, the gag a cruel reminder. He wanted to run, to flee, to never see this place again, but his body refused to move. His mind screamed against the weight of what he had uncovered. The boys had not only been murdered, they had been restrained, trapped, made to suffer. And whoever had done it had buried them here deliberately, tethered to the oak as though bound to the forest forever. Victor knew then that the park wasn't just haunted, it had been fed. Victor stumbled into the clearing where his camp had been, his lungs burning from the run, his arms locked protectively around the bundle in his jacket. The skull pressed hard against his ribs, as if reminding him it was still there, fragile but undeniable proof of the nightmare buried beneath the oak. He expected relief when he saw the faint glow of the fire pit ahead, some anchor of familiarity, but what met his eyes froze him in place. The camp was gone. His tent, his food, his lantern, even the map he had left folded beneath his pack. Everything had been stripped away as if erased by unseen hands. Only the blackened circle of the fire pit remained, and above it, taped cruelly to the trunk of a nearby tree, hung the photograph of the four boys. His throat tightened as his gaze traced the image. Someone had scratched his own face onto the photo with jagged lines, placing him among the missing. The marker strokes were rough, almost carved into the paper, and the sight twisted his stomach. Victor dropped to his knees, panic clawing at his chest. His hand trembled as he reached toward the fire pit, drawn by the strange glisten of the soil. It looked too dark, too heavy, and when he pressed his fingers into it, his hand came away sticky. A metallic smell rose immediately, sharp and undeniable. His pulse spiked as he whispered, "No, no, this can't be." He rubbed his hand against his pants as though the stain might vanish, but the smear remained, a red reminder that this was not animal blood. Human. For a moment, he wanted to flee. His mind screamed at him to abandon the woods, to take the skull and run until the trees thinned and the sky opened. But then he noticed something else. Leading away from the fire pit, pressed deep into the soil, were footprints. Not the light, uneven prints of children circling him at night. These were different. Heavy, adult-sized. Each step sank with deliberate weight, the gait purposeful, leading straight back into the woods. Victor's breath caught. Someone was here. Someone had been here all along. His throat felt dry, but he whispered aloud, trying to ground himself. If there's someone, then there's an answer. If there's someone, then maybe. His words faltered as fear overtook the fragile thread of logic. Still, he rose slowly, tightening his grip on the skull. Against reason, against every instinct begging him to turn back, he followed. The footprints wound through the underbrush, branches scraping his arms, roots twisting underfoot. Each step made the silence heavier, until even the night seemed to hold its breath. Victor pressed onward, the sound of his own heartbeat roaring in his ears. When he finally stopped, it was because the trail had ended. Before him yawned the mouth of a small cave, half hidden beneath a jagged ridge of stone. The earth seemed to bow into it, as though the ground itself recoiled. Victor's stomach clenched as he caught the faintest flicker of firelight from within. Shadows danced along the stone walls, moving in rhythms too steady to be chance. Then came the sound, low, guttural chanting, words carried on a voice that was human yet wrong, each syllable dragged as though dredged from the earth itself. He froze, leaning into the stone to steady himself, his body rigid with both fear and certainty. His mind raced. This wasn't the past repeating in echoes. This wasn't just the woods playing tricks. Someone was inside, alive, their voice weaving through the cavern air. The realization came with a sickening clarity. This was not over. It had never been over. Victor pressed his back against the ridge, his breathing shallow. His hand tightened around the bundle in his jacket, feeling the hollow weight of the skull. The chanting swelled and fell like waves, filling the cave and spilling into the night. He could not make out the words, but he felt their intent. Not prayer, not song, ritual. His legs shook, torn between rushing forward to end it and fleeing before the voice noticed him. He lowered himself slowly to the ground, every muscle straining to remain silent. His thoughts spiraled. Was this the killer? Had he been here for 7 years, hidden while the town forgot? The chanting grew louder, closer, until Victor thought the voice might be speaking directly to him. He pressed a hand over his mouth to stifle his breathing, forcing himself to remain still. The forest around him seemed to lean toward the cave, the trees bending inward as though listening. Victor's own ears rang with the sound, each note vibrating through his skull. His vision blurred as fear battled with grim resolve. He knew he could not turn back. Not now. If the boys had been trapped by this man, then their cries, their laughter, the photographs, everything was born of him. Victor steadied himself, eyes fixed on the cave mouth, his heart beating so loudly he feared it would betray him. The chanting carried on, relentless, words he could not understand, but whose meaning he felt in his bones. His body trembled, but his thoughts sharpened into a single truth. This wasn't just the echo of past crimes. Someone, perhaps the very killer, was still here, performing whatever ritual had bound the boys. The forest's ghostly voices were not alone. There was flesh and blood inside the dark. Victor crept deeper into the cave, his spine pressed against the damp stone as if the rock itself could shield him from the sight before him. The air was heavy, sour with smoke and the pungent stench of rot, each breath coating his throat like ash. His lantern trembled in his grip, its light spilling across the uneven walls and catching on shapes that made his stomach clench. Effigies, dozens of them, arranged in a careful circle. They were small, no taller than a boy's knee, built from snapped bones, knotted twine, and scraps of fabric that clung together in grotesque familiarity. Torn sneakers with missing laces, denim strips stained dark with time. a plaid shirt sleeve frayed into threads. Every piece was once worn by children. Every piece whispered of the missing boys. Victor's pulse thundered in his ears, his mind telling him to retreat, but his legs refused. The effigies trembled in the faint draft that curled through the cave, as though alive, bowing toward the figure at the circle's center. A man knelt there, thin as a corpse, his back bent in unnatural arcs. His hair hung long and gray, greasy strands dangling across his sunken face. His eyes caught the firelight like shards of glass, gleaming not with madness alone, but with something far older, deeper. He rocked slowly back and forth, clutching a tattered book so brittle its pages looked ready to crumble at a touch. Victor froze, caught between terror and disbelief. This wasn't just some vagrant or a recluse hiding in the woods. This man believed in something, believed it so fiercely that he had carved his life into the stone of this cave, into these effigies of children. The man's lips moved, words spilling in a mutter too low to follow. But Victor could hear the rhythm, the cadence of ritual. A chant. He leaned closer against the wall, the stone slick beneath his palm. His lantern flickered, casting shadows that made the effigies twitch in his vision. The stench of burning wood and old blood clung to everything. His heart hammered against his ribs, yet still he couldn't turn away. His eyes fixed on the fragments tied to the effigies, denim stiff with stains, sneakers half-rotted, shirts torn down the seam. Recognition struck like a blow. He had seen those same descriptions in the old reports. They belonged to Ethan, Caleb, Marcus, Jonah. The muttering stopped. Silence pressed down like a weight, broken only by the faint hiss of the fire. The man's head jerked upright, snapping with unnatural speed. His eyes, two pinpricks of fanatical light, cut across the cave and locked on Victor as though they had known all along where he stood. Victor's breath caught. He clutched his lantern tighter, his other hand inching toward the pocket knife he carried, though he knew it was nothing against whatever this was. His thoughts screamed at him to move, to run, but his body betrayed him. He stood rooted, staring into those gleaming eyes. The man smiled. It was crooked, unnatural, stretching his face into a mask of delight. His lips cracked as he whispered, the sound hoarse yet filled with trembling joy. Another one. Victor flinched as the words echoed through the cavern, bouncing off stone in hollow layers. The man rose slowly from his knees, the book still clutched to his chest, bones and twine clattering around him as the effigies quivered with emotion. His shoulders hunched like a predator's, his gaze never breaking from Victor's face. The forest, the man rasped, lifting a skeletal finger toward the circle, always gives me another. The words slithered into Victor's mind, coiling with dread. He understood now. This man believed the woods fed him victims, drew wanderers in like moths to flame. And tonight, it was his turn. Victor swallowed hard, the sound loud in the cave. His knuckles whitened on the lantern handle, the light shivering wildly as if it too feared the man's presence. His breath came shallow, and his chest ached from holding it in. The effigies seemed to lean closer, their empty sockets turned toward him, their twisted forms clattering faintly as if restless for what was to come. Every instinct in Victor screamed to flee, to dash out into the night and never look back. Yet some deeper part of him, driven by dread, by duty, by the memory of the boys whose faces he had seen in the old photographs, forced him to stand, forced him to listen. Because if he ran now, he knew the forest itself would not let him leave. The man took one step forward, his bare feet scraping against stone, and the firelight caught the sharp edges of his grin. His voice cracked with glee, every syllable carrying the weight of ritual, of ownership, of hunger. The forest always gives me another. Victor's pulse thundered in his ears as the gaunt man rose slowly from the cave floor, every movement accompanied by the unsettling rattle of bones and twine. The effigies that circled him trembled as if alive, their hollow sockets catching the glow of the fire and throwing strange shadows across the walls. The man's frame was little more than skin draped over bone, Yet there was a terrible strength in the way he straightened, as though some force beyond human animated him. Victor's hand shook violently around the pocket knife, the blade no longer a weapon, but a child's toy against whatever he now faced. His throat was dry, his breath caught between fight and flight, and still he stood frozen before the figure who smiled with cracked lips and hollowed cheeks. The boys were chosen, the man rasped, his voice scraping like stone across metal. The words echoed unnaturally, as though the cavern itself repeated them with grim approval. His eyes, wild and burning with fanatic light, locked on Victor's trembling form. Their fear fed the roots, their silence sealed the pact. He raised a hand toward the circle of effigies, fingers crooked like talons, and the air in the chamber plummeted to a biting cold. Victor's breath appeared in thin, white clouds, his body shivering not only from the chill, but from the terror that pressed into him from all sides. From the corners of his vision, movement stirred. Shadows lengthened, coalescing until shapes emerged, for boys, child-sized figures that stepped closer with stiff, unsteady motions. Ethan, Caleb, Marcus, Jonah. Victor recognized them instantly, though their faces were warped by horror. Their eyes were sunken hollows, their skin stretched too thin, their mouths bound by invisible threads that held back silent screams. The sight struck Victor harder than any blow. He staggered back, tears blurring his vision. Yet they did not reach for him with malice. Their hands extended in trembling supplication, pleading without words. Victor's thoughts raced. These boys had not come to harm him. They sought release. His chest ached at the truth of it. They were trapped, bound not by choice, but by the ritual the man had woven. Their suffering stretched across years. His knuckles whitened around the knife, but even he knew it was useless. The true weapon was clutched in the man's skeletal hands. The oak-carved book, thick with age, its surface darkened by oils and soot. That was the anchor, the prison, the key to whatever bound the boys. Let them go. Victor's voice cracked through the cavern, hoarse but defiant. His knees shook, but his words carried a raw edge born of desperation. The man only laughed, a sound sharp and hollow, like brittle branches snapping in frost. Go? They're the forest now. They're its breath, its hunger. They cannot go. Nor can you. He hugged the book close, fingers clutching it like a priest guarding sacred scripture. Victor's resolve hardened. He lunged forward, his entire body driving toward the ritualist. The cave erupted in chaos. The man snarled, his frail arms surprisingly strong as he fought to hold the book close to his chest. Victor grappled with him, their bodies colliding against the circle of effigies. The bones and twine clattered to the ground, scattering across the stone floor like broken idols. The fire roared higher as though fueled by their struggle, smoke choking the air and stinging Victor's eyes. With a surge of strength born from terror, Victor ripped at the book. Its binding cracked, pages tearing loose and fluttering into the flames. Ash burst into the air, carried upward in a storm of sparks. The man shrieked, clawing at the falling remnants, his nails raking across Victor's arms in frantic desperation. But the damage was done. A scream tore through the cave, not from the man, but from the earth itself. The walls shook violently, dust raining down from the ceiling as if the mountain itself cried out in pain. Victor staggered, clutching the whistle around his neck as the sound filled every corner of his body. The boys' figures wavered in the smoke, their forms breaking apart like mist unraveling in the wind. Their hollow eyes fixed on Victor one last time, filled not with fear, but with gratitude. Then they were gone, dissolving into the trembling air. The man collapsed to his knees, the remnants of the book clutched against his chest. His face twisted in anguish, eyes wide with despair as he howled, "You've doomed us all." His voice echoed endlessly, merging with the rumble of stone as the cave ceiling groaned above them. Victor stumbled backward, his lungs burning, his hands raw from the struggle. Rocks fell in heavy crashes, the ground trembling beneath his boots. The man clawed at the shattered book even as earth poured down around him, burying his body in stone and silence. The forest outside roared in response, wind howling through the trees, branches splintering, the very ground quaking under Victor's feet. Yet amid the chaos, the children's whispers faded, thinning until they were no more. The unnatural cries that had haunted the woods for 7 long years were silenced. Victor stumbled out into the night air, chest heaving, sweat and ash clinging to his skin. The whistle lay warm in his palm, pulsing with a strange weight. He looked back once, the collapsed cave sealed in darkness, and felt a shudder deeper than fear. For the first time in 7 years, the woods no longer cried. Victor emerged into the night, unsure if he had ended the curse, or simply passed it on to himself. By morning, Victor staggered into town, his steps uneven, his face streaked with dirt and dried sweat. His jacket hung loose around his shoulders, torn from the night's desperate crawl through the underbrush. In one arm he cradled a bundle, the skull wrapped carefully in cloth, and in the other he gripped the cracked wooden whistle so tightly that the imprint of it carved deep into his palm. His eyes were wild and bloodshot, scanning the faces of men pausing on the wooden sidewalks, their expressions shifting from idle curiosity to unease. Conversations stilled as he lurched forward, each step echoing on the cobblestones. He pushed open the sheriff's office door with his shoulder, nearly stumbling inside. Sheriff Dalton Reeves looked up from his desk, a coffee cup halfway to his lips. The sight of Victor, a stranger, gaunt and trembling, froze him. "Sir, you're hurt," Dalton said, rising slowly, his voice measured, cautious. "Sit down before you fall." Victor shook his head violently, clutching the bundle tighter. "There are graves out there," he rasped, his throat raw. "Children. 4 of them. I saw the chains, the bones. The cave, it was real, I swear it." His voice cracked, desperation breaking through the thin veil of control. Dalton exchanged a glance with Deputy Hayes, who shifted uneasily in his chair. "Easy now," the sheriff murmured, palms raised as if steadying a skittish animal. "Tell me slow. You said children." Victor stepped forward, dropping the bundle onto the desk. The cloth fell away to reveal the fragile curve of a small skull. The room went silent. Dalton's jaw tightened, but he forced calm into his tone. "Where did you find this?" "In the woods." "Shun Ridge," Victor said, his voice trembling with exhaustion. "Gray Hollow." There was a cave, a man, rituals. He dragged in a breath, his chest heaving. "I heard them. The boys. They never left." Dalton leaned over the skull, studying the brittle surface with furrowed brows. He was a man who had seen death, accidents, and worse, but something in the hollow sockets unsettled him. "Deputy, fetch a cloth," he muttered, then looked back at Victor. "We'll go take a look. But if you're making this up, I'm not," Victor cut in, his voice sharp with sudden fire. "I buried them. Their names, their faces, I know them now. Ethan, Caleb, Marcus, Jonah. They've been calling for years, and no one listened." His voice faltered, and he collapsed into the nearest chair, burying his face in his hands. Later that day, Victor led the search party back to Gray Hollow. The men moved cautiously, rifles slung over their shoulders, their boots crunching on damp soil. Victor pushed ahead, his face pale with determination, every step guided by memory. "It was here," he insisted, stopping before the ridge where the cave mouth had gaped the night before. The deputies spread out, lanterns raised. But the cave was gone. In its place lay a slope of fresh earth, sealed as if the hillside had collapsed years ago. No entry, no firelight, no effigies. Dalton crouched, pressing a hand to the soil. "It's solid," he said flatly. "You sure this is the place?" Victor stared, his breath quickening. "It was right here," he whispered, his voice breaking. He shoved at the earth with his bare hands, clawing until his nails split, but the soil gave no sign. "No poleroids, no clothing, no bones." Only the oak tree stood at the clearing's edge, scarred and trembling in the breeze. Victor staggered toward it, gripping the whistle. "There," he said, pointing to the rusted chain still buried in the ground. "Tell me you don't see that." Dalton frowned, stepping closer. The chain was real, its links eaten by rust, the metal biting into the roots of the tree. Yet without context, without proof of what Victor described, it was nothing more than debris. Could be old logging gear, Dalton said carefully. Or hunters. Nothing to prove your story. Victor laughed, hollow and bitter. You think I wanted this? You think I came here for tales? His voice rose, echoing through the trees. I carried this skull out so someone would listen. Someone had to put them to rest. That night, back in town, Victor refused to hand over the whistle or the remains. When Dalton pressed him, he only shook his head, eyes hollow. They've been left too long without peace, he murmured. He dug graves by lantern light in the consecrated ground behind the church, marking each with a simple stone and the boy's name scratched into them with shaking hands. As he covered the last grave, he whispered, "Rest now. You're safe." But sleep did not bring him peace. In dreams he still heard the faint whistling, thin and mournful, winding through the trees. He would wake slick with sweat, the sound clinging like mist. Sometimes he stood by his window at night, staring toward the black outline of the park, his heart caught between terror and obligation. The townsfolk spoke of him in hushed tones. Men at the tavern muttered that he was haunted, cursed, touched by the same shadows that had claimed the children. Mothers pulled their sons closer when he passed, whispering prayers. Yet others swore that Victor could be seen at dusk, standing at the edge of Shun Ridge, silent, unmoving, as if waiting for someone unseen. And still, when the wind cut sharp across the branches, the faintest laughter of boys carried through the night air. Because in Shenandoah National Park, no soul ever truly vanishes, they are only claimed. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of horror, violence, and the dark mysteries surrounding unsolved crimes. Its purpose is to evoke suspense, highlight the fragility of safety in familiar places, and spark reflection on the importance of vigilance and community protection.